In the spring of 1980, the man you're seeing here became one of America's most unlikely celebrities. His name was Harry R. Truman, a World War I veteran turned bootlegger turned mountain man who, in this frame, is standing outside of his lodge, smiling and waving toward a camera in the distance. On its own, there's nothing unsettling about the image, but for those who remember him, almost every detail takes on a much darker meaning. The wave, the location, the date it was captured, and above all, the man himself. The frame comes from a news report filmed from a helicopter. Today, if you look up the exact coordinates where this footage was recorded, they'll lead to nothing more than an empty spot on the open waters of Spirit Lake in southwest Washington. But on May 15, 1980, the day this footage was filmed, that exact spot was home to one of the most talked about lodges in the Pacific Northwest, sitting between Spirit Lake and Mount St. Helens. 3 days later, Truman and his 16 pet cats would be killed in the deadliest volcanic disaster in US history. Truman was born in West Virginia in 1896. He'd served in France during the First World War, tried prospecting when he came home, then turned to smuggling alcohol from San Francisco to Washington. A few years later, he leased around 50 acres at the foot of Mount St. Helens, where he set up a gas station, a small grocery store, and the Mount St. Helens Lodge. He stayed there for the rest of his life, becoming one of the most peculiar local figures people on the mountain remembered for all sorts of reasons. He drove a pink Cadillac, swore frequently, and had a particular dislike for, quote, Republicans, hippies, children, and the elderly. Then there were the things that went further. He'd poach, steal gravel from the Forest Service, overcharge people on tax, and fish on Native American land with a fake badge. If someone argued with him, things could get physical. He was known to throw people into Spirit Lake over small disagreements, including one of his 3 wives, despite knowing she couldn't swim. By the late 1970s, some experts had begun predicting a major seismic event at Mount St. Helens. The volcanic zone had been practically inactive for 123 years, and some suggested it could wake up before the turn of the century. That would prove to be a massive underestimation. On March 16, 1980, the first earthquake in more than 100 years was detected beneath the mountain. Over the next 11 days, hundreds more followed, along with a steam explosion that punched a 1,300-foot wide crater through the summit ice cap. Within 2 months, the northern flank was bulging outward by around 450 feet, and roughly 10,000 earthquakes had hit the mountain directly. Authorities began issuing evacuation alerts across the region. Of course, the one man who was particularly difficult to convince was Truman. As the threat made primetime headlines, news outlets arrived to cover the evacuations, and Truman quickly became one of their favorite people to talk to. In interview after interview, he dismissed the warnings, challenged the authorities, and came up with a new reason each time why he wasn't leaving. The strange part was that even his own statements didn't agree with each other. At one point, he claimed that the threat had been exaggerated. Then he'd acknowledge the mountain might blow, and say that if it did, he'd simply go down with it. Other times, he denied it was close enough to hurt him, despite his lodge sitting at its foot. Where his reasoning ran out, there was always the stubbornness. Nobody could pull him out, he insisted, not even with a mule team. He was part of the mountain, he said, and the mountain was part of him. To the authorities, this was more than an eccentric old man refusing to listen. Every reporter who flew in to speak with him was taking the same risk he was, and his refusal was turning an evacuation into a national spectacle. But the same attitude made him strangely popular with everyone watching from a distance. The grumpy, rule-cutting lodge operator was suddenly being portrayed across the country as a defiant mountain man who refused to abandon his home. He received hundreds of fan letters, gifts, and even marriage proposals from women he'd never met. According to his cousin, it was probably the peak of his life. Now we come back to this picture. On May 15, 1980, officials and members of the media made one last trip to Truman's lodge, where he was now living alone with his 16 cats, whom he called his family. Once again, he refused to leave, and gave another over-the-top interview, as confident as ever. As the crew left by helicopter, they recorded Truman walking around outside his lodge, seemingly unaware he was being filmed. Then he noticed the camera, looked up, and waved. This would be the last time he was ever recorded on footage. 2 days later, authorities reached out one final time to give him a chance to change his mind. To no avail. At 8:32 a.m. the following morning, May 18th, Mount St. Helens erupted. The northern flank collapsed, sending the largest recorded landslide in history racing towards Spirit Lake. On top of it came a massive pyroclastic surge, engulfing everything around the lake in minutes. The area was buried beneath roughly 150 feet of volcanic debris. According to some experts, Truman and his cats would likely have died almost instantly from the extreme heat, too quickly to even register the pain. No remains were ever recovered. The eruption temporarily displaced much of the water in Spirit Lake, but when it settled back, the debris left behind had permanently expanded the lake's boundaries and raised its surface, and because of that, where Harry Truman's lodge once stood, there is now just water. Here we have perhaps one of the most talked about people of recent times, Oliver Tree, alongside Argentine YouTuber Gatsby. The picture was taken on June 13, 2026 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, just hours before the helicopter ride that would turn Oliver's already viral world tour into headlines for all the wrong reasons. Oliver's last performance in Brazil came in Sao Paulo on June 6th, and his next scheduled show wasn't until July 1st in Lisbon, giving him a few weeks to himself. He had been spending that time in Brazil, filming content and working with Gatsby and filmmaker Lucas Vinale on an upcoming production. Nothing about the photograph looks particularly unusual. Oliver is smiling and Gatsby is standing beside him, and the two simply appear to be enjoying another night in Rio. On April 2nd, 2026, Oliver took to Instagram and announced that he was parting ways with Atlantic Records, bringing an end to a partnership that had lasted roughly a decade and produced some of the biggest songs of his career, including Hurt, Life Goes On, and Miss You, which together had been streamed hundreds of millions of times. The split largely came down to creative differences. For the previous 2 years, Oliver had been on the move, traveling through 82 countries and all 7 continents while writing, recording, and producing his album, Love You Madly, Hate You Badly. He wanted the music to be a genuine reflection of everything he had seen, felt, and experienced along the way, and even called it his hardest and most favourite work yet. But apparently, the label wasn't quite on the same page. Atlantic Records reportedly didn't take the release of the album seriously and wanted Oliver to lean harder into commercially driven music made for short-form platforms. Just a few weeks after the announcement, on April 24th, Oliver released the album through his own imprint, Alien Boy Records, making it the first collection he produced entirely by himself. He announced a similar music show tour that was supposed to span all 7 continents, covering more than 30 countries, with over 70 shows, including a stop in Antarctica. However, he only made it as far as Brazil when, while traveling by helicopter over Rio de Janeiro, his Bell 206B Jet Ranger crashed into a Eurocopter mid-air. Along with Oliver, on board were Gatsby, Lucas Vinale, Brazilian music producer Lucas Frota, and the pilot of the helicopter, Alexandra Souza. On the other aircraft was only its pilot, Charles Marcillac. All of them were killed in the crash. The 2 helicopters went down about 100 meters apart, with the one carrying Oliver Tree crashing into a parking area filled with electric cars and catching fire. The flames quickly spread to around 20 vehicles, while the lithium-ion batteries in the parked cars made the fire much harder to put out. Because of this, the bodies were burned to the point where identification required the use of dental records. On top of that, since neither helicopter was required to carry a black box, there was no exact record of what happened in the moments leading up to the collision. What we do know from the ongoing investigation is that the crash happened after the 2 helicopters somehow ended up in the same flight corridor at the same altitude, despite coming from and heading to completely different locations. That's an extremely rare situation in itself. Why it happened though, and who was ultimately at fault, has yet to be determined. People online, however, have come up with all kinds of theories and conspiracies surrounding Oliver's death, many of which revolve around his recent departure from his deal with Atlantic Records. A lot of people believe he was killed because he left the label, which again, is something as confirmed as anything else. Looking back at the picture, it captures what you'd call life in motion. Oliver was on the trip of a lifetime, doing what he spent years building his career towards. He made some tough choices along the way because he wanted to look back on his work years later and see it as a piece of art, rather than just another commercial project. But somewhere in all of those plans, he probably hadn't considered the possibility of it all ending so tragically and so early, just like anybody else around him. This photograph was taken by a woman named Freesia Gall on June 20th, 2026, at the top of Nevada Falls in Yosemite National Park, California. Freesia was having lunch with a few friends when, taken in by the breathtaking view in front of her, she pulled out her camera and captured a picture of the Merced River, sitting between massive trees and granite rocks, with a few people scattered along its banks. At first glance, it was just another beautiful Yosemite view, frozen in time, but when Freesia looked a little closer through her lens, she noticed something that turned the photograph on its head. Right in the middle of the frame was a man in the water, wearing a hat. From a distance, it looked like he was simply swimming in the river, completely at ease. Except he wasn't. He was trapped in the deceptively calm waters of the Merced River, just moments away from being swept over the falls to his death. The man in the photograph was 22-year-old Josue Beirez Alfaro, who had come to the United States when he was 17, seeking asylum after his brother was killed in gang violence back in El Salvador. Living with his relatives in LA, Josue barely had any time away from his job as a construction worker, but whenever he did, he usually spent it outdoors. The trip to Yosemite was one of those rare days when he and his friends decided to put work aside, get some fresh air, and go on a hike. However, somewhere along the trail that day, he slipped on the slick granite rock and fell into the river, immediately getting caught in a strong undercurrent. The waters of the Merced River are notorious for hiding extremely lethal currents beneath deceptively calm surface water, and things only get worse as the river nears the approximately 600-foot drop in Nevada Falls. Not only that, since the river is fed directly by deep layers of winter snowpack that accumulate across the upper elevations of the Sierra Nevada mountain range, a sudden plunge into the freezing water can induce cold water shock, leading to severe gasping, panic, and a rapid loss of muscle strength. In other words, even if you knew how to swim, the river could take that ability away from you in seconds. Though at the time the picture was taken, Josue wasn't exactly looking panicked. Perhaps he was still trying to fight in the current on his own, unaware of just how little control he actually had. But Frisia, who had previously served as a volunteer lifeguard, immediately realized that he was trapped and would need assistance. Without giving it a second thought, she jumped into the freezing water fully clothed in an attempt to reach him. However, almost immediately, it dawned on her that the currents were too strong for even her to handle. She did manage to get close enough to Josue that, at one point, he made direct eye contact with her, but by that time, struggling in the chaotic, powerful waters, Frisia was no longer trying to save him. She was trying to keep herself alive. Eventually, with the help of other bystanders, Frisia was pulled to safety. Josue, however, was swept downstream and carried over the falls. His body wouldn't be recovered until the following day. The disturbing part of this photo is that it's a horrific memory of a person's final moments, now preserved forever for his family, who had perhaps already been devastated by the loss of Josue's elder brother. Anyone who saw him that day, realizing that he was going to be carried towards the falls as he struggled to keep himself away from them, would probably never forget the unsettling scene. A few days after the incident, Frisia also took to Facebook to express how the incident had affected her, saying that she would be taking some time offline to process what had happened. In describing the moment she made eye contact with Josue, she said she knew he was going to go over the falls, adding that when you make direct eye contact with someone in that situation, quote, you can't turn around. Sadly, she had to, because if she hadn't, she would have been dead too. These two photographs were taken almost 3 months apart in Australia. Here we have a young German couple, Gabor and Anya, standing on a beach surrounded by other vacationers in December 1991, enjoying the Australian summer. In the second image, taken from what appears to be a home video recorded in February 1992, we can see two English friends, Caroline and Joanne, sitting among another group, apparently having a good time too. As you can see, the people in these two photographs appear to have no connection whatsoever. They had travelled to Australia from different parts of the world at different times, and as far as anyone knew, they had never met. But there is one small background detail that links these two pictures. The Germans and the two friends were all backpackers. This would make much more sense once you know that, somewhere along their journeys, all of them crossed paths with the same man. 21-year-old Gabor flew into Darwin, Australia, with his girlfriend Anya after a sudden monsoon season brought their hitchhiking trip through Indonesia to an early end. The two had been exploring the country's volcanoes and geological features when the bad weather ruined their plans, forcing them to find somewhere else to stay for a while, and that somewhere ended up being Australia. With Christmas approaching, the couple wanted to make their way to Bondi Beach, so they travelled to the east coast, backpacking along the way, and eventually reached Sydney just days before the event. Here, they checked into the original backpackers hostel in King's Cross, which seemed like a cheap and reliable option. However, the hot and sticky weather and the strange nightlife in the area at the time didn't sit particularly well with them. After just a few days, they had had enough and wanted to head north again, back to Darwin, before flying out to Indonesia on New Year's Day to resume the trip they had been forced to leave behind. From there, they would eventually return to Germany, with their flight scheduled for January 14th. On December 26, 1991, the two checked out of the hostel, telling the staff about their plans for the days ahead. However, this would be the last confirmed location they were ever seen. The couple never flew out of the country, nor did they make it home when they were expected to. Despite months of investigation by the Australian Federal Police and PIs hired by their families, the trail eventually went cold. At the time of their disappearance, the case was still relatively unknown in the area and received very little attention from the media. However, that would change a few months later when two British backpackers, Joanne and Caroline, all went missing from the King's Cross area, leading people to wonder whether the two disappearances could somehow be connected. Unlike the German couple, Joanne and Caroline had arrived in Sydney separately for a working holiday. By September 1991, 22-year-old Joanne Walters had been living in King's Cross Hostel for around 3 months and was working as a nanny when she met 21-year-old Caroline Clark. Caroline had arrived more recently and was looking for a job that would allow her to earn some money while still giving her plenty of time to continue traveling. The two eventually became friends, and Caroline soon found what seemed like the perfect job for her. It was fruit picking, and after several other backpackers recommended the work to them, Joanne soon left her job as a nanny and joined Caroline as well. The seasonal work gave the two a way to make a decent amount of money while still keeping their freedom to move around, and with hitchhiking covering much of their travel, they were able to keep their expenses relatively low. They spend their days working and their free time traveling, meeting people along the way as they continue to catch rides and enjoy the kind of adventure they come to Australia looking for. By early 1992, the two had spent several months traveling around together and had become comfortable with life on the road. They had worked picking grapes in Victoria, later found more work in Tasmania, and eventually returned to Sydney. It was back in King's Cross in April where they learned that it was melon picking season in the west. They were already planning to explore the area, so they figured there was no better time to go. On April 18th, they set off from King's Cross to continue their journey, once again planning to hitchhike most of the way along one of Australia's major national highways, the Hume Freeway. Spanning 840 kilometres, the Hume Freeway is one of the busiest interstate routes in Australia, connecting the country's two most populous cities on the east coast, Sydney and Melbourne. Today, after years of constructions and upgrades, the road is a continuous dual-lane freeway, allowing traffic to travel through the region without any interruptions. However, back in 1992, the highway passed through numerous towns and rural areas, with intersections, traffic lights, and plenty of places where drivers had to slow down or stop. For backpackers trying to hitchhike their way along the highway, these were the places where they could stand by the roadside, hoping that someone would stop and give them a lift. Sometime after leaving the hostel, Caroline and Joanne were seen on a mountain road called Bull Pass, which was connected by a short driving corridor to one of the Hume Freeway stopping points. Apparently, they were asking for a lift from Bull Pass to the highway where they could begin the main leg of their journey. However, from that point on, their trail, much like Gabor and Anya's, went cold too. For those who don't know, the Hume Freeway is also the main road providing access to Belanglo State Forest. The area, spanning roughly 40 square kilometers, contains around 700 hectares of commercial pine plantations, bordered by several thousand hectares of native wild timber, making it one of the most cut-off and isolated places in the country. Once you get inside, the seemingly endless rows of trees quickly separate you from the road and the outside world. For a hitchhiker, that means accepting a ride from the wrong person could take them from a busy roadside to an isolated stretch of forest in a matter of minutes, without anyone knowing where they had gone. And that's exactly what happened in both of these cases. Between 1989 and 1992, an Australian serial killer named Ivan Marco Millett, later known as the Backpack Murderer, was active along the Hume Highway at connecting roads, picking up hitchhikers and offering them rides before taking them, unknowingly, into the Belanglo State Forest, where the fateful journey would end in prolonged sexual and physical assaults, and eventually a brutal murder. Over the course of 3 years, Ivan was responsible for at least 7 confirmed murders of backpackers, including Gabor, Anya, Joanne, and Caroline. From September 1992 to November 1993, investigators discovered all 7 bodies in roughly the same area of forest, with the victims showing similar signs of a brutal attack. Gabor, for example, had been bound and shot 6 times in the head, while Anya had been decapitated by a heavy blow and had also suffered multiple gunshot and stab wounds. Joanne had been subjected to a prolonged stabbing attack, suffering at least 14 wounds that severed her spine, while Caroline had been shot 10 times in the head at very close range and also suffered a stab wound. Following the discovery of the remains, The case quickly attracted media attention, and it was this coverage that eventually led one of the survivors, Paul Onions, to come forward and identify Millat as the man who had attacked him years earlier near the Hume Freeway. Authorities then searched Millat's home, where they found several belongings of the victims, along with maps of the Belanglo State Forest and the Hume Highway, further linking him to the crimes. Millat never pleaded guilty to the murders, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. He was eventually convicted of 7 counts of murder and sentenced to 7 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. He remained in prison until his death from esophageal cancer in October 2019, at the age of 74. This photograph was taken on May 28, 2015, outside Manchester Airport. The people in the picture are the Iqbal siblings, children of a woman named Sugra Dawood. From right to left, starting with the girl in the pink jacket, we have 5-year-old Maria, 3-year-old Ismail, and 8-year-old Zainab. Standing behind them are 15-year-old Junaid and his 14-year-old brother, Ibrahim. Along with their mother, the 5 children are travelling with Sugra's 2 sisters, Zora and Khadija Dawood, and their 4 children. Here the family of 12 are about to board a flight from Manchester to Saudi Arabia for the Islamic pilgrimage. They were supposed to return to the UK on June 11th, after what was meant to be a 13-day trip, but 48 hours before their flight, something happened that would put a very different context on this otherwise ordinary family photograph. The group would lose contact with their relatives back home, and from that point onward, their whereabouts would become increasingly disturbing and difficult to trace. Sugra Dawood was the eldest of the 3 sisters. They also had a brother named Ahmed, who sometime between 2013 and 2014 left his home in Bradford and travelled to Syria to join ISIS in its fight against the regime of Bashar al-Assad. The siblings came from a Muslim British-Pakistani family, and although they had been born and brought up in Bradford, they hadn't really left behind their conservative, and at times somewhat extreme views of their family or their interpretation of Islam. As the 3 sisters got married and started having children of their own, they became increasingly concerned by what they saw as the open and modern lifestyle around them. They believed that this environment was unsafe for their children, and wanted to eventually move somewhere that was closer to their own values and beliefs. But before any of that could happen, Ahmed left. His departure prompted West Yorkshire police to start looking into why he had gone to Syria and what exactly he was doing there. Ahmed stayed in touch with his sisters over Skype, something the counter-terrorism officers knew about and actually encouraged, hoping the conversations would give them a way to keep tabs on him. But the plan would end up backfiring. Instead of bringing him any closer to the authorities, Ahmed was able to convince all 3 of his sisters to travel to Syria and join him. In a matter of just a few months, the sisters quietly put the whole trip together, from leaving Britain, getting to Saudi Arabia, and eventually making their way into Syria through Turkey, all without telling their husbands or apparently even their own parents. On March 19th, using the Islamic pilgrimage as a cover, the 3 women and their 9 children booked a flight from Manchester to Jeddah, but before they could board, they were stopped and questioned at the airport under the Terrorism Act as part of the ongoing investigation into their brother. They missed the flight, but that wasn't going to stop them. The family then contacted West Yorkshire Police, complaining that they had been wrongfully prevented from travelling. In response, the department gave them a letter of clearance confirming that there were no restrictions on them entering or leaving the country, apparently because they had been playing cooperative with the authorities in their efforts to track down their brother. To make the whole thing look even more routine, they also asked their children's schools for leave during the pilgrimage. The requests were denied, but they had gotten what they needed out of them. With everything now in place, the group tried again on May 28th, and this time, they made it through. As planned, they did visit the pilgrimage sites, but 2 days before they were due to return on June 11th, the family boarded a flight from Medina to Istanbul, paying for the tickets in cash. That was when they switched off their phones, cutting off contact with their husbands and parents back in Bradford. On June 17th, the youngest of the 3 sisters, Zora, left her parents a voicemail confirming they had made it to Syria. She said they had left because of what she described as oppressive surveillance by counter-terrorism police. The last real clue to the group's whereabouts would come almost a year later through a series of Facebook posts made by Sugra's son Ibrahim. In one of them, he appeared in militant combat gear, holding a weapon. In others, he shared pictures of various firearms and called on Muslims around the world to join the so-called Caliphate in Syria and pledge allegiance to its leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the founder of ISIS. Then, in what would turn out to be his final post, Ibrahim shared a tribute to his uncle, Ahmed Dawood, and his older brother, Junaid, referring to both with an Arabic prayer that translates roughly to, "May God accept them." It's a phrase commonly used when referring to someone who passed away. The post itself never said what happened to either of them, but given the wording, it seems likely that both Ahmed and Junaid were dead. Considering what would eventually come of the family, the picture outside the airport makes for a much more chilling image. The younger children in the front look ordinary. The two boys behind them appear noticeably more reserved. Of course, a photograph can't tell us what they were thinking, but knowing what happened afterwards, it's hard not to wonder whether either of them had any idea where this ship was really going to take them. Here you can see 18-year-old Akira Murray posing for the camera with a peace sign. The photo was taken on June 11, 2016 at a condo near the theme parks in the Orlando area. Akira is wearing an all-black outfit, holding a phone in one hand, while a television in the background is showing a news report about the death of singer Christina Grimmie, who had been shot at a concert in Orlando the night before. There's something particularly strange about the news being there, considering what would happen to Akira just a few hours later. Akira came down to Orlando from southwest Philadelphia with her family to celebrate graduating high school. She'd finished third in a class of 42 with honours, put up more than 1,000 points for her school's basketball team, and landed a full scholarship to Mercyhurst University. The plan was to spend a week celebrating before she headed off to start the next chapter of her life. Her cousin Tiara Parker and Tiara's best friend Patience Carter were staying with them too, and that Saturday night, the three girls decided they wanted to go out dancing. After looking around for places that allowed people under 21, they settled on a gay club about a 40-minute drive from their apartment, called Pulse. That weekend, it was hosting a Latin night, which meant they'd be around all kinds of people they'd never met before, and for three recent high school graduates, that was pretty exciting. Tiara, who worked as a makeup artist, helped the other girls get ready, and after taking a few pictures in the lobby of their condo, the three girls headed out. The next few hours went by in a blur. Caught up in the warm, welcoming atmosphere of the club, the girls completely let their hair down. They danced, laughed, chatted, and just enjoyed being together. Before they knew it, it was well past midnight. They figured it was time to call it a night and made their way toward one of the exits while booking an Uber, but just then, they heard a strange banging sound that went on for several seconds. Like everybody else, at first they thought it was loud music coming from another room. It was the unsettling wave of screams and panic spreading through the crowd that told them they were hearing gunshots. Almost instinctively, Akira and Patience dropped to the floor and started crawling toward the nearest exit. They managed to make it out, but the moment they looked around, they realized Tiara was still back inside. In what would turn out to be the decision of a lifetime, the girls went back in for their friend. They eventually found her, but by then, getting back out wasn't going to be nearly as easy. Several people had already been hit, broken glass was scattered everywhere, and in the darkness and chaos, they couldn't even tell where the exit was anymore. With nowhere else to go, the group retreated into a bathroom and squeezed themselves into a handicap stall with around 20 other people, hoping they could stay out of sight, but that wasn't going to be enough. The gunman, 29-year-old Omar Mateen, was still making his way through the club, exchanging fire with the on-duty police officer and shooting at people as he went. When he reached the bathrooms, he fired through several closed doors, hitting the people hiding behind them. All three girls were caught in this gunfire. Patience and Tiara survived their injuries, but Akira was hit in the arm, with the bullet severing a major artery. For the next 3 hours, the girls remained trapped inside the stall alongside several other injured and dying people. Akira called her parents, her brother, who she was especially close to, and eventually 911 herself, desperately begging anyone who could hear her to send help because she was afraid she wasn't going to make it. But there was only so much anyone could do. Slowly, Akira lost consciousness, and eventually she died in the lap of her cousin Tiara, becoming the youngest victim of the attack that night. By then, what had started as an active shooting had turned into a hostage situation. Mateen had barricaded himself inside the bathroom with the surviving victims, and over the next few hours, he spoke with police negotiators 3 times, claiming allegiance to ISIS and threatening to detonate bombs that were never found. Shortly after 5 a.m., SWAT officers breached the building and killed him at the scene. By the time it was over, 49 people had been murdered, and another 53 had suffered gunshot wounds, making it the deadliest terrorist attack on American soil since 9/11, and at the time, the deadliest mass shooting in modern US history. Looking back at this picture, the two things about Akira's personality that made the whole incident so hard to digest are her kindness and her ambition. She was known for being very caring toward the people around her, especially her family and friends. A lot of people claim to be that kind of person, but the fact that she had already made it out to the club that night and chose to go back inside to save Tiara says a lot about how genuine that notion was. Then there were her plans for the future. Akira intended to study criminology, partially because she'd grown up in a neighborhood where street crime was a fact of everyday life. She wanted to understand what drives people to commit acts of violence like this, but before she ever got the chance, she became a victim of one herself. This is a group photo of a preschool class from Jiangqiang Kindergarten in Taipei, Taiwan. Among the people we can identify are 5-year-old Cheng Yudong, the boy wearing glasses, and 31-year-old teacher Li Qingchuan, standing on the far right of the back row. On May 15, 1992, the school had planned a field trip for its preschool classes to Liufu Village Theme Park. It was originally supposed to happen about a week earlier, but a shortage of buses from the transport company forced the school to push it back to May 15th. Unfortunately, even that day, only 3 of the required buses were available. So at the last minute, the school brought in 2 more buses from another company to make up the difference. One of those buses ended up carrying 53 people in total, including 42 students, 11 teachers, and parent chaperones. Among them were several of the people we can see here in the photograph. At around 11:40 a.m., the bus was passing through a particularly rough stretch of highway when the constant shaking apparently caused an old power transformer to short circuit. The electrical fault then spread toward the back of the driver's seat, where several cans of gasoline and paint were being stored. It didn't take long for the highly flammable materials to catch fire. Within minutes, the bus was filling up with thick black smoke, making it almost impossible for anyone to see. What happened from there is based largely on the survivors' accounts. The driver apparently opened the front door straight away, giving people a way to get out. He then ran toward the back of the bus to open the emergency exits, only to find that the handles were stuck. With no other option, he kicked out a window and escaped, leaving everyone else inside to fend for themselves. The fire burned for around half an hour. During that time, several adults desperately tried to force open the emergency exits or use the fire extinguishers to fight the flames, but the exits were jammed by old rusty locks, while the extinguishers were years out of date and barely of any use. Making things worse was the terrible visibility inside the vehicle. Most of the passengers were preschoolers who couldn't find the only exit door or some kind of broken windows. Some of the adults who managed to escape or had gathered nearby after seeing the massive vehicle go up in flames tried to help from outside or even went back in to get the children out. One of them was Ling Qingchuan. She managed to escape fairly early on, but over the next half hour, she kept going back inside and coming back out, eventually managing to save 6 children. But during her final attempt, the fire cut off every possible way out, leaving her trapped inside. When her body was found later that day, Lin was still embracing 4 small children, trying to shield them from the flames in her last moments. By the time the fire was finally put out, 20 children had died, including 5-year-old Cheng Yudong, along with 2 parents and Ling Qingchuan, while 9 others were injured. The investigation was quick to point out that the fire itself was only part of the problem. The bus had several serious safety issues, including illegally modified seats, defective emergency doors, an outdated transformer, and fire extinguishers that were not only expired and 3 years old, but were also stored outside the vehicle in the luggage compartment, making them practically useless in the event of a fire. The driver of the bus and the head of the transport company were eventually convicted of negligent homicide, receiving sentences of 4 and 3 years respectively. Investigators also found that the school had failed to properly check the buses, drivers, and transportation arrangements before the trip. The negligence was considered serious enough that the school's registration was revoked, and it was ordered to stop enrolling students in August 1992. The tragedy also led to changes beyond the courtroom. Within months, Taiwan revised its road safety regulations, making emergency exits and fire extinguishers part of the required inspection for large passenger buses. In 2007, the date of the tragedy, May 15th, was officially designated as National Children's Safety Day in Taiwan. Li Qingchuan, who became the hero of the tragedy, was also given the country's first ever civilian martyr title. A statue of her holding a child, as flames engulf her, was first created in 1996, and replicas have since been installed at several locations across Taiwan. And that's the end of the video, folks. If you enjoyed this one, then please be sure to give it a like, leave a comment, subscribe if you're new, and consider supporting me on Patreon. All patrons get early access to videos, and higher tiers get their name on the screen and a shout out. I'd like to thank all my patrons for their continued support, especially those whose names you're seeing on screen now, particularly Luca Dorita, Matt is on Fire, Alora Laterano Kane, Matthew, Father Figure, Alana Polden, JJD04, Raina, Toka355, The Amazing Crazy and Scary World of Squishy 200815, The Vampire, Soaked Pigeon, Bradley Stewart, Stalsturm, John Aaron Snow, Bohag, Vampiric Misfit, Henrik Fan 5, Sonny Hauser, Bailey Cosmic Black Metal 96, Mimi, Light into Sunlight, KJ Musical, Losanna, Brandon Field, Helen Korn, Kyle, Brendan O'Connell, Adam Clayton, Count Nagula, Edward Howard, Danny Jade, Paul Mendoza, Alex Christmas, Bella Schwartz, Belsey Gell, Stimulate, Inquisitor Arius, and Dick the Cock Johnston and the Woodmaster of WrestleMania X69 or Maybe Not Dude. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Goodbye.